Hello and welcome to this seminar titled Epistemologies and Music, How Might We Know What Music Does? Before I begin, and since this is my first seminar with you, I'll briefly introduce myself so you can understand a little about the position from which I share the ideas today. So my name's Jo, I'm a community musician and a practitioner researcher from East London, England, and my practice mostly includes collaborative songwriting, and group composition workshops. I have taught music in primary and secondary schools, including mainstream and additional needs settings, and higher education. And I currently work as a research fellow for York St John's Institute for Social Justice. So today's seminar picks up from the last seminar you had with Dave, where you looked at an introduction to philosophies of music education. In that seminar, you explored questions to help you think about what is important in your music education practice in relation to you, your students, and your wider communities. And we're going to do the same today, but this time by considering what music might do and how we can come to know that. So let's begin by taking a moment to think about what music might do. So you'll find a Mentimeter on Moodle. If you go to the Theory into Practice page and scroll down to Seminar 21 and select the webinar link, it will take you directly to the Menti. So like last week, the Mentimeter has two questions that we will come back to throughout this seminar. The first question is, what can music do? And this is taking the idea that music has the capacity to transform or to affect in some way. This could be to transform or affect people, situations, or something else. Building on the idea that music does things, the second question asks more specifically, what can music education do? I'm going to invite you in a moment to pause this video and take some time to answer the questions. As you do this, think about your engagement with music and your music practice. You can add multiple responses, and you can pause this seminar whenever you like to return to the Mentimeter as you reflect on the ideas that are presented, and you can add more thoughts in. So take some time now to complete the Mentimeter and come back to the seminar when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Music has been said to do many things, underpinned by the belief that music has social, psychological, biological, cognitive health, and other impacts. Claims about what music does includes social transformations. For example, the idea that music can support peace building, social inclusion, and work towards issues of social justice. Personal transformations. For example, the idea that music can build an individual's self-esteem or an individual's confidence levels or their sense of possible selves. And increasingly that music can support improved health and well-being outcomes, including both physical and mental health. Over the last decade or so, we've seen a really big increase in arts and health initiatives with the premise that music is good for you. You might have heard of, for example, social prescribing projects or health musicking alongside more traditional music therapies. In recent decades, there's seen a growth in practices, research, and resources underpinned by music's potential to transform. So I'm just showing you this slide now by way of offering a few examples, just a few, and I'm going to start with a practice example. So Hear Me Out is an organisation that runs music projects for people held in UK immigration detention. They work with people to express their humanity through music, and as part of their work, They use music as a tool for social connection between those in immigration detention and those outside. So this example, Hear Me Out, is operating from the premise that music can humanize and music can connect. And I'm just going to note here that the descriptors of the projects I've taken from their project websites. So I'm using their terminology. The next example is Music in Prisons, and this is part of the Irene Taylor Trust. They run music projects in prison to create a positive learning experience that can help to raise the self-confidence and aspirations of those they work with and reduce reoffending rates. So Music in Prisons is operating from the basis that music can rebuild individuals. And the last example is the English National Opera's BRIEF programme. This is a social prescribing non-clinical intervention that uses singing techniques to aid recovery from COVID-19. So here there's the understanding that music, or more specifically singing, can support COVID-19 recovery. These are just a few examples of practices that work on the basis of what music can do, and there are, of course, many more. Turning to research, we also find claims about what music does. Susan Hallam's The Power of Music offers a prominent example. In this book, Hallam asserts the benefits of music education, multiple and many, for children and young people. Just to note that the first publication by Hallam is the book in black with that green play button. And that was published in 2015 with the title, The Power of Music, a research synthesis on the impact of actively making music on the intellectual, social, and personal development of children and young people. And this was later reworked. Susan Hallam reworked the text alongside Evangelos Himonides, apologies for the pronunciation there, and they amended the title to The Power of Music and Exploration of the Evidence. So this reworking, the book cover that you can see in white with some splodges of bright colour, really naming it an exploration of evidence, I think is pointing to this growing need for evidence bases, an evidence-based agenda, and thinking about how we can come to know what music does. As a further point, I'm just going to show two more books by way of demonstrating that what music does has been considered across different fields. It's been considered in terms of social justice in music education, and I'm showing the Oxford Handbook of Social Justice in Music Education to demonstrate, and through the lens of music, health and well-being. And I'm showing a publication by MacDonald, Kreutz and Mitchell there. All the references from this PowerPoint are available on Moodle. So what music does is being increasingly considered through research. And I'll just offer a couple of contemporary examples of projects that are taking place now, research projects, to consider what music does. The first is the Creative Change Project based at Griffith University in Queensland, Australia, which is exploring the role that community music can play in creating greater social equity in Australian communities. And the next is the Centre for Performance Science, which is a partnership between the Royal College of Music and Imperial College London. Their Arts in the City project investigates the impact of participatory music encounters on social connectedness, well-being, loneliness, and integration in Salvador and Cochabamba. So it's not just in the UK that we're considering that music does stuff. There are other parts of the world that are also considering these questions. What does music do, and how can we come to know? Finally, I've added a couple of podcasts to this slide that may be of interest. They include discussions around what music does. The first from Young Musicians for Social Justice. These are young musicians based in Leeds, England. And the second from the Social Impact of Music Making, which is an initiative that was developed in Belgium and works in Europe and beyond. Links to the examples shown on this slide are also available on Moodle within the folder for this seminar. Lastly, before moving on, you'll notice that my points of reference are all in the positive domain. All of the projects that I'm showing on this screen hold varying beliefs around music being good for you. Music can do good things, but it can also do bad things. And the use of music to rally fascist groups is an often cited example. Another more recent example of the ways in which music might be bad for you is the work of music sociologist George Musgrave. He considers the negative impacts of the music industry and associated poor mental health of musicians. And there are, of course, other examples. Having heard about these examples of practice and research, I invite you to pause the seminar and return to the Menti. Go back to those two questions. What can music do and what can music education do? And see if you want to read some of the responses or add some more ideas. Okay, before turning to how we might come to know what music does, I want to take a moment to consider UK cultural policy. Now, I'm turning to the UK because that's where I'm from and that's where I practice and where I teach. I encourage you to consider the policies and practices of your locality and the ways in which they might inform and shape what music does and what you do with music where you are. In the UK, the application of music to do useful things was an idea that gained momentum during the 1990s. Labour, the political party in power at the time, set up a social exclusion unit. Tony Blair, who was then Prime Minister, asked this unit to consider how to develop integrated and sustainable approaches to the problems of the worst housing estates, including crime, drugs, unemployment, community breakdown, and bad schools. Notice Tony Blair there is observing social exclusion in housing estates. These are his words. So he wanted to know how could we solve the problems of social exclusion. Well, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport at the time replied that creative participation in the arts could tackle not only the symptoms, but the causes of social exclusion, generating benefits in all four of the government's priority areas of health, crime, employment, and education. So it's interesting there. It's suggesting that creative participation in the arts, including music, might be a way to solve issues of social exclusion. Now, this came at a time when there was growing momentum for what has been considered as an instrumentalizing of the arts. I'm not going to go into that too much now in interests of time, but the debate between music as instrumental and intrinsic, or intrinsic, I should say, is another binary that you may want to pick up on in your tutorial discussions. As Dave mentioned in the last seminar, placing things in opposition might not always be helpful. What I will mention now, though, is Francois Matarasso's report, Use or Ornament. Francois Matarasso is a freelance community artist, writer, and consultant. And he wrote Use or Ornament, which is a large report of a large-scale study on the social benefits of the arts, published in 1997, which is just 2 years before the Department for Culture, Media and Sport reported that creative participation in the arts could tackle the symptoms and causes of social exclusion. In Use or Ornament, Matarasso wrote, a marginal repositioning of social policy priorities could be very significant. A little art can go a very long way. He said, for now, we can say only that participatory arts projects are different, effective, and cost very little in the context of spending on social goals. They represent an insignificant financial risk to public services, but can produce impacts, social and economic, out of proportion to their cost. So this is really interesting. Throughout the report, Matarazzo argued about the positive social impacts that arts and music could make. And he's now placing an economic argument for the arts, saying that actually, if we use them to address issues of, social exclusion, for example, or to meet our social goals, they might be a cost-effective way. Now, with government concerns of the costs associated with social exclusion, it's unsurprising that this was picked up in policy. So policy and research of the 1990s, accompanied by national lottery funding streams, in practice led to the growth of arts projects with the explicit remit of solving the symptoms and causes of social exclusion. And that explicit remit is important because in return for the funding to achieve these aims and objectives, those people that were funded, the organisations and practitioners, were required to demonstrate evidence of how they'd achieved their remit. So they were required to evidence how their arts project had brought about the change that they said it would. And we see an increasing enthusiasm for evidence and data today. And one might think about the debates in education around research-led teaching, for example. Okay, so if music does stuff, how can we come to know that? Well, perhaps the first step is to consider that claims about what music does are connected to beliefs and ideas around what music is for, what music is. And these are ideas that you explored in the last seminar with Dave. So what music might do can depend on understandings of what music is. So you might want to go back to the mentee from your last seminar, seminar 20, what is music for, and just see if you want to make some connections between the answers of what music is for and what music does. Furthermore, if we're going to consider how we can come to know what music does, this really depends on what we think counts as knowledge or knowing, what counts as evidence. And this is an epistemological question, epistemology being the branch of philosophy that is concerned with knowledge. And as a branch of philosophy, epistemology aims to answer questions such as, what is it to know? How do we know? What is known? And who can know? So these are big questions, what is it to know? How do we know? What is known? Who can know? If we're going to consider how we know what music does, we need to consider these types of questions. So traditionally, knowledge has been thought of broadly in two ways. The first that we will look at in this seminar is positivism. Taken at its most extreme, the positivist paradigm concerns hard facts, which rely on measurement and reason, with the idea that knowledge is revealed from a neutral and measurable observation of activity, action, or reaction. This kind of knowledge is often referred to as quantifiable, and positivism states that if something is not measurable in this way, it cannot be known for certain. Now that's really interesting for music because we might feel as music makers that as people engage with music, that music does something in our bodies. We might feel that it does some kind of good or does something. But how can we come to measure that feeling, or how can we come to know what we know of that feeling? And if we can't measure it, does it mean that that can't be known? These are some very interesting philosophical kind of conundrums to reflect on. Okay, returning to positivism. From a positivist perspective, What is measured is done so objectively. So that being data is obtained without interference, or in other words, facts are out there waiting to be discovered and transcend time and cultural location. This suggests that anything that cannot be observed and thus in some way measured, that is quantified, is of little or no importance. The question is then, how do we measure music? How can we quantify music? Something that is felt, tacit, in the body, and that is made between those that make it, that comes into being in relation. So a number of issues have been raised with positivism. I'll just touch on two for now. The first is the issue of objectivity. To what extent is objectivity possible, for example? And the second relates to issues of measurement. Is measurement limited? What can be measured? Can measurement always be accurate? So these are two ways of kind of probing or problematizing the positivist paradigm. Let's look at objectivity first. So from a phenomenological perspective, what can be known about phenomena comes about through engaging with the phenomena. Or in other words, what is seen or heard or experienced is seen, heard, and experienced by someone. So knowledge is generated by someone or a group of people, actually. Knowledge is generated by seeing, by listening, by experiencing, and therefore it's bound up with the experiencing of that. Don Ida, the phenomenologist Don Ida, wrote this book a long time ago called Experimental Phenomenology, an introduction, and he's since written later texts. There's one on a listening phenomenology and there's one on post-phenomenology. And I'm just using this as an example to think through the objective in the positivist paradigm through Don's visual experiments. So in this book, Don has a number of kind of visual ways of thinking through how it might be that we come to know. So just looking at the front cover, Don's showing a number of line drawings of three-dimensional cubes, shapes, and two-dimensional shapes. And I'm just going to be looking at what Don says is the way we look at something in guides how we see it. So I'm looking at the bottom shape there, which I'm seeing as a 3D cube. And I'm currently seeing it as a box shape with a top that you could put stuff in. That's the bottom largest shape. But if I look at it again and I kind of bring some of the lines from the background to the foreground and some from the foreground to the background, and I play around with where those lines are on the page, suddenly that box has jumped for me and I can suddenly see that the bottom of the box is on display, but I can't see the top of it. It's kind of shifted. I just invite you to really look at these objects, spend some time looking at them and see if you can shift the way that you're seeing them. So at the moment, I'm seeing the box where I can put things into it, the bottom box. But if I move some lines from foreground to background, I suddenly see it's almost as if I'm looking at an upwards cuboid light. So I could look into the base. And then if I look again at the center and I see a parallelogram with kind of 6 shapes around the side, making in total a big kind of diamondy shape. I'm now seeing it as a 2D net, seeing it quite differently. So just take a moment to look at those. You can pause this video here if you want to. What these visual experiments are doing is that they show to us that what is seen is decided upon or comes into being through the way we see it. So we can't say that this is the bottom shape there is a 3D cube, but I might see it that way, but somebody else might see it as the 2D net version. And I think this phenomenological approach, the musicians knowing, is an exemplar of that. You know, what musicians know and how they come to know is often deeply personal. It's embodied, whilst at the same time being constituted in relation, as their embodied knowing is developed through musical and social interaction with others in a given context. So think about the way you might refine your musicianship in the context of a group rehearsal, for example. Okay, from feminist scholarship, objectivity is also problematized. Donna Haraway, who's a professor in the departments of history of consciousness and feminist studies, describes this as the God trick. So this is a challenge to the belief that hard data and unquestionable fact exist somewhere out there to be found by neutral observers. With the God trick, Haraway asserts that there's no view from nowhere. Knowledge comes from a knower. Subsequently, power dynamics must be recognized in inquiry, and those undertaking inquiry need to be attentive to the context of discovery, not only the context of justification. So we need to be aware of how we came to the insights, not just what we're trying to say, how we came to the findings, not just the findings themselves. So thinking about the context of discovery and justification, let's move on to measurement now. Turning to measurement, well, measurement requires a way to measure, and that might sound straightforward. Think about the device that you're watching this video on, for example, whatever that might be. Imagine you want to measure that device. You might take a ruler and you might measure how many millimeters or centimeters, or if you're watching this on something very big, I hope not, it may be meters. The idea is you want to measure something, you have a measuring device, you can find out how long something is, how big something is. And if you don't have a ruler, you could use something else. You might use your hands and give a rough approximation. So in some senses, measurement can seem straightforward, but it isn't. It's dependent on agreed conventions and the apparatus available to measure. And physics is an area that has demonstrated the limits of measurement. Measurement devices only allow us to see or know that which can be measured. So in the area of physics, for example, early measurement devices could only categorize light within one property, but it consists as both wave and particle. So this is really showing the limits of measurement. Our measurement devices for light only show one property, but it actually has two properties. And that's quite problematic. It kind of shows the limits of how we can come to know through measurement devices. So if measuring requires a way to measure, it could be thought that what we can measure, or rather what we can know, is limited to what we already know, or what we already have developed tools to know. And I think that's quite an interesting thought. To what extent is what we can come to know, to what extent is that which we're trying to know limited by stuff we know, by the measurement tools that we know? Not being very clear. Maybe pick up on that one in your tutorials with Dave, or email me. Okay, so what does this all mean for music? Well, I want to take a moment to consider music as a practical subject. Robin Nelson, who's a scholar that has done a lot in terms of practice as research, he explains that we do knowledge, we don't just think it. So if we take, for example, a person's knowledge of how to ride a bike, as Nelson explains, this is practical knowledge. It's that of know-how. since to know how to ride a bike is to ride it. The tacit and embodied knowledge of, for example, knowing how to balance or how much force to exert on the pedals, that offers a simple instance of knowing in doing. And the musician's knowing might be equally understood as offering a clear example of knowing acquired through doing. So one might say to know how to play an instrument is to play it, or to know how to make music is to make it. Drawing on philosopher Donald Schoen's outlining of knowledge in practice, Nelson advocates doing knowing to describe the practitioner's tacit, embodied, and experiential know-how. As a performing art, the musician's knowing is embodied, enactive, embedded, and extended, and you could see Eliot and Silverman's work on this. Musicians gain their knowledge of how to play an instrument, play in a group, or improvise, for example, through the incremental and iterative experiencing of playing an instrument, playing in a group, and improvising. As Schoen explains, our knowing is ordinarily tacit, implicit in our patterns of action and in our feel for the stuff with which we are dealing. It seems right to say that our knowing is in our action. And for musicians, the feel for the stuff, for example, the touch of the strings on the guitar, or the felt vibrations of reverberant sound in a room, or the feeling of connection as you play with others in an ensemble, is of particular significance. And from this line of thinking, one possible way that we might come to know what music does may lie in focusing on the doing of music to understand music. And that might be what we term practice research. So returning to positivism, Matarazzo explains that the application of concepts from the natural sciences, such as proof, measurement, and impact, to social experiences, and especially to art, is problematic. It's difficult to apply concepts from the natural sciences to art and to music, because music, as Dave Camlin suggests in his book Music Making and the Civic Imagination, is a complex adaptive system. In other words, music is the idea that music in its totality has multiple meanings, which it arrives at through a series of complementary mechanisms, which are broadly psychological, biological, social, behavioral, and of course musical. So Dave will talk about this in more depth with you over the next coming seminars. But for now, I touch on the notion of music as a complex adaptive system to show that how we might come to know what music does is complicated. And since complex adaptive systems arrive through a series of complementary mechanisms, which could be in the hundreds or more, as Dave will discuss with you, then choosing to set up apparatus in a particular way to look at a particular phenomenon is to make a cut in the experience in order to be able to observe it. So in other words, I think Dave is explaining, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, that if music is a complex adaptive system, which is about multiple complementary mechanisms at play, if we isolate one of them to consider how that might affect or do something, then actually we're changing the phenomenon itself. This act of cutting in and of itself changes the phenomenon under observation. So this points to the problematics or the potential problematics of models based on causal relationships, or at least it suggests that they need a bit more thought. Okay, we've touched on positivism. Now let's consider interpretivism. Now, interpretivism relies on questioning and observation. This is because it's based on the assumption that knowledges are multiple and socially constructed, and that reality is subjective. That is to say, we can only understand someone's reality through their experience of that reality, reminding us of the phenomenological approach, which may be different from another person's who's been shaped by a different historical or social or cultural or other perspective. So the subjectivity of knowledge is therefore for grounded. This kind of knowledge is often referred to as qualitative, whereby questioning and observation are used to generate rich and deep understandings of the phenomenon being investigated. So we're almost getting to the end now. Thank you for listening. But I invite you to just take one more moment to pause the video and to reflect on positivism and interpretivism, and when they might be useful in helping us to know what music does. You can make your own personal notes. As you do this, you could look at the answers in the Mentimeter to prompt your reflections. For example, you might choose one or two things that music has been said to do in the Menti, and then you might think about how helpful positivism or interpretivism may be in helping us to know whether indeed that is the case. Okay, so as Dave explained last week, and we touched on a little through our discussions today, placing ideas in simple opposition is not always helpful. So it might not be a case of, placing positivism and interpretivism against each other, qualitative and quantitative against each other. So for a final discussion on ways of knowing, we're going to look at pragmatism. And in the interests of time, this is a very brief look that could go deeper. So pragmatism rejects traditional philosophical dualisms and privileges ways of knowing based on how well they work in solving the problems under investigation. So a pragmatic exploration of what music does, for example, might involve multiple methods, some of which could be familiar to either of the more traditional schools. However, it has to be noted that pragmatists don't have to use multiple methods. Instead, they use methods or a combination of methods pragmatically in order to advance a specific piece of research in the best possible manner. Pragmatism views knowledge as being constructed and based on real world experiences, where meaning is created from human experience. And truth is viewed as tentative and it changes over time. So we might talk about truths. We might not think about a truth as something being solidly there, but there might be truths. And pragmatism endorses theories that inform practice, practical theory. So making one connection to music education philosophy, and just one because I'm getting to the end now. By way of an example, I think there seems to be some resonance with praxial notions of music education. So Rogalski, for example, notes that praxial knowledge is highly individualized since it results from an agent's accumulated experience with the always situated and variable particulars of this or that individual group. However, this doesn't mean that pragmatism is simply an answer to how we might come to know what music does. This is in part because the ways of knowing available, and those we discussed today, are ones we already know about. And as the physics example showed, measuring light, where we could only measure it as a one thing, because that's the tool we had, but it's actually two things. What can be measured is dependent on the mode of measurement available. There may be other ways of knowing, ones that better resonate with the complexity of music that are yet to be known. I'm really interested in that. I'd love to talk more about that. So I've spoken for a long time now, so I'm going to come to a pause. The question of how we might know what music does is an important one. This is not just because of the increasing need for evidence with evidence-based agendas, but this is from an ethical perspective. If as musicians we believe music can do things, And furthermore, if we aim to do things through music, then we need to be clear about what music can do and how we can come to know that. So, even though the issues of knowing what music does are complex and at times contested, they're not to be ignored. And on that note, I'm going to end with one final quote from Matarazzo. The problem is not with evaluation, which is integral to all creative work, but how, by whom, and why it is done. The long and costly effort to prove art's social, economic, and intrinsic value is entangled in a political culture concerned with control, not knowledge, or the wisdom of experience. To what extent do you agree with Matarazzo? It is at this point and several earlier points that I wish I was with you live to be able to discuss some of these ideas. But instead, I'm going to invite you to pick up on any of the ideas that interested you in your tutorial or class discussions. And you can also email me. That's it for now. Thank you for listening. Bye.